This was a pretty special way for the Kings to break the playoff drought and right away play in one of the most entertaining first round series of all time and one of the most watched first round series of all time, and obviously losing it in a pretty heartbreaking way in game 7 at home when you outplayed the Warriors in the first half and then you get blown out in the second half. Just lose composure in the third quarter, lose it to rebounding. But it was still an extremely good season and an extremely good effort in this series when most people were picking the Warriors to win in, well, less than 7 games. So I'll talk about what went wrong, what went right, and just why the Kings were able to get it to 7 games, but not able to, in the end, pull out the win. And the first thing that I want to say is we need to stop the Domantas Sabonis slander. Okay? People calling him Ben Simmons 2.0, just some crazy things. People saying the Kings' ceiling is lower trading for Sabonis rather than Halliburton. People saying that, oh, now this trade looks bad somehow, which is insane. And then, that's like one end of the spectrum, but still a lot of people saying even things like Sabonis is just not a playoff player or things like that. And I just need to right away address why this is all flawed, why all these statements and arguments are flawed. And I'm not saying that Sabonis had a great series. He didn't. He could have played better than he did. He could have played better offensively, but the series loss is not just on him. Kevon Looney getting a million offensive rebounds is not just on him. Could he have done better? Of course. I think the things that he could have done better was one, defensive rebounding. But that's a whole team thing. He needed guys to help with that, and other guys did not help with that. Two, I think he just needed to shoot the mid ranger more. He's talked about that. A lot of people have talked about that. And, in the first half of game 7, he did that brilliantly, and then he went away from that. And I think one thing in relation to Sabonis in that mid range jumper is he used to not be able to shoot that. He used to be horrible. Like in his first playoff series, he couldn't shoot from the mid range. But his percentage in this series was not bad. I think it was 42% from the mid range. And I think he's only going to improve in the mid range, and that will open things up. The Warriors came out with a great game plan to try to slow down the dribble handoff offense that the Kings have created. They gave Sabonis space, forced him to shoot basically, and he was hesitant to do that early on in the series. Kevon Looney is a matchup problem for him inside. He struggles to score on Kevon Looney, which made his percentages in the paint fall pretty drastically from what we saw in the regular season. And it wasn't until game 7 that we really saw the Kings offense look like it looked in the regular season. But saying all this, we were still in a game 7 for a reason. And so the Kings obviously were doing something right. But we didn't get there through our offense. We didn't get there through good shooting. We got there through defense because our offensive rating dropped off by a lot in the playoffs. It dropped from 123.5 in the regular season to 113.7. The offensive rating did. Now, did we expect it to stay at 123.5? No, but maybe not drop as far as 113.7. But the defensive rating went up to fifth among playoff teams at 103.1 after being at 112.4 in the regular season, which is just pretty bad, and so they improved a lot in on the defensive side. And I think we have to give a lot of credit to Sabonis for this, which is something that people I feel like haven't talked about at all. Sabonis was actually pretty good defending the interior, forcing turnovers, getting blocks, and just defending the interior as well as he can, because this Kings team isn't really built around defending the interior. But what the Kings did do is they did a good job of chasing around Warriors shooters, and they forced the Warriors into the third least amount of wide open 3-point attempts in the playoffs in the first round. And that is per game, so 13.4 wide open 3-point attempts for the Warriors per game. And they were also those 3-point attempts, which wide open is 6+ feet, I believe. A lot of those 3-point attempts were from players that the Kings were just letting shoot. So Gary Payton, Draymond Green, Moses Moody at times, although he knocked him down. So it forced the Warriors into a pretty bad shooting percentage. 35.1% on those wide open looks is not great. But the problem for the Kings offensively was just how horrible the 3-point shooting was. And I guess there could be a few reasons for that. The first reason could just be we got unlucky. Guys went cold at the wrong time. The second reason could be guys were just tight. It was the playoffs. The pressure got to them. And then I think the third reason could be that the Kings shooters were tired from chasing the Warriors around on the other end. I think that's a pretty big possibility, and I think that, with a guy like Kevin Huerter as the main example, I mean, he's chasing around Klay Thompson the entire time and did actually a pretty good job defensively for most of the series, although there are a few games where he was pretty bad, and let like Jordan Poole go right by him a few times, and a few games where he was just bad defensively, but overall I thought he was pretty good. But then when he goes to the other end, I think he takes a lot of energy on his 3-point shots. He gets his legs into his shots a lot, and that could be one of the reasons that he shot poorly. I wanted to look at the stats for the Kings shooting. And so you look at the Kings and the Warriors shooting numbers. They were tied for third worst in the playoffs in above the break 3-point percentage at 31.6%. So pretty bad. And there was almost no one who shot above average. You had Keegan at 8 of 20. You had Monk at 12 for 33. You had Fox at 19 for 56. Him taking 56 is pretty crazy. And then you have like Barnes at 4 for 17 and Huerter at 6 for 30. And no one else shot well either, but I won't list them all off. And then when you look at the corner threes, that's where the difference is between the two teams. And it's at the Kings shot the second worst percentage of the first round at 28.6%, and the Warriors shot a 37.1%. And so again, it's Huerter at 2 for 9, Monk at 1 for 6, Davion at 1 for 6, Fox at 2 for 7, Barnes at 2 for 7, Keegan at 4 for 12, Lyles at 4 for 16. Everyone who took, a substantial amount, like over 2 attempts, shot horribly on corner threes. And so then you might think, well, were they, difficult threes? Were they maybe off the dribble threes? But then you look at the Kings' catch and shoot percentage. That's the second worst of the first round at 30.3%, down from 37.6% in the regular season. And then you think maybe it's because they weren't, getting open. Maybe the defense was good. And it's like, no, not that either. Kings had the third most wide open 3-point attempts per game at 19.3, but shot the third worst percentage on them at 34.8. Pretty much every single player in terms of their wide open 3-point percentage in this series was way down from the regular season. And the only guy that got close was Keegan at 7 for 16. in this series, and in the regular season, he was at 46.9% on wide open threes. And then you have Herter going 3 for 17 on wide open shots and 3 for 16 on open shots. Barnes at 2 for 10 on wide open shots and 4 for 13 on open shots. And pretty much the whole team shot poorly in the open category. You look at Fox when he was open, 8 for 34. Monk was 6 for 23. So it's really pretty simple why the Kings lost. Like, if they just hit open threes, they probably win this series. I mean, you look at what was it, game 3 or game 4? It was game 4 when, Barnes had that open shot to win the game. And, obviously, it's not one shot that decides it. But I just think that that's a perfect example of what went wrong the entire series. The Kings' most important shooters shot the worst percentages. But it was the Kings' defense that kept them in the series. And, I think that's all season long, there's been a question mark of, can the Kings step up defensively come playoff time? And everyone's looked at the clutch defensive numbers for the Kings in the fourth quarter defensive number for the Kings and see that they were pretty good fourth quarter defensive team and pretty good in clutch time and won a lot of clutch games. And so maybe they can step it up in the playoffs, although there are a lot of people that were skeptical, but they did it. They stepped up defensively. They forced the Warriors into tough shots. And of course, the Warriors are going to make a lot of those tough shots. I mean, you look at when the Warriors were in tight coverage on threes, they shot a league leading in the playoffs, 9.4 per game, and shot 36.4% on those. They shot better when tightly covered than when wide open. And obviously we knew coming into the series that was going to be, the Warriors shot making is just different from any other team, especially from three, obviously. But for most of the series, the Kings did a pretty good job of withstanding it and not allowing it to snowball. And that was one of my keys coming into the series was don't let things snowball. Don't let offensive rebounds turn into three-pointer after three-pointer. And that is exactly what happened. They did a pretty good job throughout 6.5 games of that. And then I think their inexperience showed in the third quarter of Game 7 when that exact thing happened. Things snowballed because of offensive rebounds and kickouts, because that's when the Warriors are going to get their best looks from three, or they're able to pump fake and get to the rim easier off those kickouts from the offensive rebounds. I think when you look at how horrible the Kings starters shot, especially in the first 3 games, all 3 of Barnes, Herter, and Keegan Murray were horrible shooting the ball. And then, the whole time I was expecting at some point all of them to step up. But in reality, it was only Keegan Murray that stepped up for the last 4 games. Which, by the way, is very encouraging. And I'll probably touch on that more when I recap the whole season. But that is a very encouraging sign to see what Keegan was able to do in this playoff series and bounce back from a tough 3 games. But every single game, it just felt like the Kings were holding on until the bench could come in to hit some threes, to make something happen offensively. The bench was really good for the Kings. They led all teams in bench scoring in the first round at 40.3 points per game. Obviously, Malik Monk at almost 20 a game was the biggest part of that. Most teams are going to get less bench scoring in the postseason as opposed to the regular season, but the Kings actually got 3 points more per game in the postseason than the regular season. The Warriors bench actually scored more than the Kings bench in the regular season by a very small margin. But in the playoffs, the Warriors bench went away, and the Kings bench outscored them by over 13 points per game. And that was something that we knew the Kings could take advantage of, or at least hoped they could, was the depth. The Kings were a much deeper team. But there were some interesting, rotational changes throughout the whole series, obviously starting with Alex Len, him playing very well, but then Mike Brown needing a change at some point, going small in game 6 with Lyles at the 5, and then playing more Terrence Davis as the primary defender on Steph Curry. And I think it's an interesting conversation, right? The whole Terrence Davis, Davion Mitchell thing. Because in game 6, it worked. In game 6, Terrence Davis, while he did foul out, he played pretty well in the first half. Although, I didn't think he would, like, I didn't want him to stay in the game, and I was kind of relieved when he fouled out. But it worked, and the Kings won by a lot. But throughout the first 5 games, Davion had done such a good job of guarding Steph. And I think the Kings wanted a bigger, stronger defender to get physical with Curry. But Terrence Davis, like, if we wanted that, you could have gone with Kessler Edwards. But the Kings were prioritizing keeping shooting out there for spacing to allow the offense, to keep running and not prioritizing defense. And that's what killed us in game 7. Because I don't know why Terrence Davis played so many minutes in that game 7. I mean, I talked about it on the game 7 recap. It's just, it should have been Davion Mitchell, especially after Terrence Davis was getting blown by each and every time. Because Terrence Davis, yeah, he's bigger and, he's always going to give effort, but he's not really a good defender. So I don't know why you're sticking with him on Steph. He's not a good defender. And so either Davion or Kessler Edwards, like, they're both there, and Davion's done a great job all series. So I didn't understand that. I think going small helped the Kings offensively, be able to, spread the floor and draw the bigs out from the paint. But at the same time, I think Alex Len also added some offense in terms of offensive rebounding. So I don't really think that there was a huge difference between the big lineups versus the small lineups for the Kings. I think some people were saying, like, Trey Lyles should start instead of Sabonis because of the spacing, and it's like, I mean, that's just ridiculous. I'm going to be honest here. But I think at the end of the day, those rotational decisions are not why the Kings lost. I think some of them went well, some of them backfired. But at the end of the day, it's like everyone out there could grab a rebound. And in game 7, that's kind of what it came down to. And in terms of spacing the floor, well, it doesn't really matter if you're spacing the floor if guys actually can't hit shots. Huerter and Barnes were still getting wide open, and they just couldn't hit shots. And so it didn't matter whether you had a small lineup, a big lineup, like, it didn't matter. Also, I think something that's gone overlooked is Sabonis. Everyone's talking about Kevon Looney, and rightfully so. He was a beast on the boards, but the Kings did a really good job rebounding in 5 out of the 7 games. And it was just game 3 and game 7 where they didn't. And those were the 2 games that they got blown out. I really do think, when you look at the 3-point shooting, if the Kings just shoot better, they win this series. And, the Warriors didn't shoot great either. But I think that had more to do with the Kings defense. I don't think the Warriors were necessarily defending our 3-point shooters well. And the numbers back that up in terms of how many wide open attempts we were getting per game to theirs. But overall, this series, while it sucks that we lost, I think it's very encouraging for the future of this team. And obviously there are questions around the lineup in terms of Harrison Barnes and what we'll do with him and what needs to be added to this team. But I think it shows that no matter what happens with that, what happens with the other pieces on the roster outside of the core, like, this core is always going to be dangerous. And so even though we lost, I mean, this team showed a lot of fight, especially in game 6, and they proved that they did belong as, a top seed in the West, and that wasn't a fluke. And, obviously we lost the series, but going toe to toe with the defending champs and almost coming out on top, that's still proving that it's not a fluke and that we will be back next season. So, anyways, that is it for this episode of the Royal Report. I will be making a season long recap, and I might do player grades in that. I'm not sure, but make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to know when that gets posted. And I will see you guys then. Peace.